Our first project presentation today will be with Dr. Janice Beecher from Michigan State University. Dr. Beecher was appointed as Director of the Institute of Public Utilities at Michigan State University in 2002, and now brings more than 30 years of applied research experience to the position. Her areas of interest include regulatory institutions, theory and principles, and utility pricing, and she specializes in the water sector. She is a frequent author, lecturer, and participant in professional forums. Dr. Beecher is presently serving on the US EPA's Environmental Finance Advisory Board and has served as an appointed advisor to the state of Michigan on infrastructure and water policy. She holds a BA in economics, political science, and history from Elmhurst College and an MA and PhD in political science from Northwestern University. Dr. Beecher's co-learning plan project involved looking into funding and financing infrastructure needs. How we pay for infrastructure, taxes, or user fees matters in terms of economic efficiency and distributional equity. In Michigan, constitutional law and legal precedents complicate the challenge. Disparities among communities are reflected in infrastructure disparities, and these issues are especially acute in distressed communities. This project explored policies, practices, and alternative models to address infrastructure challenges. Are you there, Dr. Beecher?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Welcome. Are you ready to present?
Yes, I am. Thank you. I like the way you say that, by the way. It always sounds very dramatic, like ready to go. So I appreciate that.
Should
Jen.
check. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So I assume you can see my screen.
Yes.
And thank you so much for having me. And first, let me also add my congratulations. That's just wonderful news.
Thank you.
And glad to know you'll continue your great work in this area. I was able to listen in all day yesterday, and I really, really enjoyed the summit. And thank you again for all that you do. So to both Rex and to Jen and to the whole team, thanks very much for this opportunity. So yeah, I'm still kind of, I still consider this a work in progress, although I actually think all of my work is a work in progress, and my whole career is a work in progress. So I feel like the work is never done. And I think this is actually a nice metaphor actually for the challenge of infrastructure. So as Jen mentioned, I'm on a couple of advisory boards, and sometimes I'm sure behind the scenes they're saying she's a broken record on some topics, and this actually happens to be one of them, this whole issue of funding versus financing and why the choices matter. And Rex and I have been exchanging some thoughts about this too. I mean, we feel like sometimes these conversations are really dominated by certain paradigms or perspectives. And so the idea here is to maybe balance things out with a few other thoughts. And but I want to caution everybody, there are no panaceas here. There are no magic solutions. I think there's a quest for that. There's constantly an interest in, well, give us a solution, whether it's to infrastructure investment or affordability or anything else. And unfortunately, there just really isn't that magical option. So we have to kind of, I think, settle to do the hard work, and settle in, frankly, to do the hard work it's going to take. So I'll just say a little bit about the institute where I work. I've been at Michigan State since 2002, but our institute's actually been there since 1965. So we're actually in our 55th year, and basically we have sort of a core mission in continuing professional education for people who work in the economic regulatory space. We've probably trained more than 30,000 people here. I've stopped counting, just like I stopped counting my career at 30 years. But we've trained people from all over the US and all over the world in sort of the theory and practice of public utility regulation primarily. So our mission is to support informed, effective, and efficient regulation of the providers of electricity, natural gas, water, broadband. They're generally considered monopolies, and the services they provide are considered obviously especially essential. And that's why, again, that's sort of what leads me to today's topic. So we do continuing ed applied research. I teach this ideal of public interest oriented regulation. So in terms of this project,
Dr. Beecher, could I interrupt for just a moment?
Sure.
Are you showing slides right now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, we're going to need you to hit your share screen.
Okay. I was, but let me go.
Yeah, could you try it once more?
Yeah. For some reason, I guess it did not take, huh? Okay.
Here we go. You're up.
All right. Very good. That's much better. So sorry about that. So,
excellent. Thank you.
Thanks for letting me know. So there's, I loved your graphics, so I actually incorporated. So I'll pause for that. So there's a little bit about us you can look at. So here's my abstract, again, still kind of fine tuning because I keep thinking of more things. That the project really, it's difficult to put boundaries on it actually. So again, we're talking about essential services. We're not just talking about, people like to say things like, internets of things, or connection of things. And we have to remember we're really connecting people and we're providing essential services. And so what we're aiming for is trying to have systems, develop systems and sustain systems that can provide an optimal compliant level of service. And that means complying with all applicable public health and environmental standards. So sustaining infrastructure really relies on a combination of funding and financing. And a big part of this project is to actually untangle those, but then in some ways reconnect them. So it's sort of a framework or a primer for understanding the differences between funding and financing, and to really focus in, as Jen said in the introduction, on sort of the distributional outcomes for consumers, but also the capital costs for providers, and the fact that these dimensions actually don't necessarily get the same level of attention as the economic efficiency questions, the behavioral incentives questions. So I'm partly here to sort of balance that out. And again, yesterday's discussion really helped me focus in on that. So there's a lot of there are alternative instruments within the funding and financing realms that I explored. And I also explore a lot of the key statistics and trends across the industries. This issue of funding gaps, infrastructure investment gaps, and how they might be addressed. And finally, I think I would say, I'm not going to go into it a lot in this report, but I think a lot of this is going to depend on more positive and constructive stakeholder engagement around these issues. I think we tend to avoid the politics, and I think we need to actually be better at that. So I could show probably, dozens and dozens of slides of infrastructure and infrastructure that's not doing so well. I am sure you've all seen these, or maybe you've even experienced them in your life. And so, there's a sense that our infrastructure is not in great condition, including here in Michigan. So I've been increasingly, this project actually kind of brought focus to that. I've been trying to use the term public infrastructure because regardless of how it's owned, how it's managed, it is public infrastructure. It is there for public purpose. And I think that's important to really keep in mind. In other lectures and studies, I talk a lot about the characteristics of infrastructure and infrastructure services, that they have characteristics of both public and private goods. And so really a correct term for them is social goods in a way, or toll goods, or goods that are provided through networks. And again, they do provide these essential services, and we know, and I'll loop back to this at the end when we talk about the report card and the funding, the infrastructure gaps. There's again a clear sense that enough infrastructure is failing in significant ways that we need to really step up our investment, that we're investing too little in infrastructure. So again, I come from sort of a public utility regulatory background, and we focus on this concept of this sort of public utility construct, which grew out of the idea of common carriers. So when we first started to see societies evolved, they had common carriers, you know, ferry boats and inns and taverns and so on, which became open to the public. And so there was an idea that they had to be sort of regulated and kept in good order for the public. And so that evolved to this public utility model. And now today we also use the term network industries, and that's sort of a socio-technical construct. And you know, there's a lot to be said for this model. It offers a lot of insight and a lot of advantages and certainly a lot of tools. But in some ways it displaces a public service model because it sort of orients us more towards enterprise solutions, market models, and sort of what we call the utility basis for rate making, which I'll come back to. But the other thing is we have this impulse now, every time there's a problem, let's form a utility, you know, and also, as I'll get to, one of the reasons for that is because then we can fund it through user fees. And so we've seen that in a great example is stormwater management. So again, the framework for my, my study is, and my report is, how do we sustain public infrastructure? And there's really these dual tracks, you know, the funding side and the financing side. So funding is who pays for infrastructure. Financing is how it's paid for. We tend to conflate these concepts regularly. Even authoritative, even academic resources will refer to certain instruments in some ways incorrectly or in a way that's not quite accurate, I should say. So on the funding side, the key instruments are taxes and user fees. In fact, I sometimes like to say, you know, we only have two pockets, ultimately. We only have two pockets to pay for infrastructure. It's one or the other. There isn't a revenue ferry. And so we're going to have to figure that out. Now, how we trace that back through the system is a really interesting question. But that's pretty much it. There's a little pinch of other, but it's almost irrelevant in terms of like contributed capital or other income that might be had. And why it matters is because how we pay for infrastructure, whether it's through taxes or through user fees, makes a big difference in people's lives. It matters in a distributional equity sense and distributional outcomes. And I'll show some illustrations of that. And then on the financing side, how do we pay for it? Well, there again, we don't have a lot of diversity there. I mean, we have some diversity within options, but the major tools are debt and equity and a little bit of cash reserves that especially public systems might keep around. But basically, we've got to really either, you know, borrow the money or somehow have investors put up the money. And we have very big differences across sectors in terms of whether we rely more on debt or equity instruments, just like we do on the funding instruments. We've got differences by sector. The implications there that I focused on are mainly the cost of capital and provider incentives. So I added the incentive issue here, but to be honest, my report is focusing more on these distributional outcomes and cost of capital issues because I don't think they are generally what gets the attention that they probably should, because I think they really do matter to the equation. So as far as our infrastructure in the country goes, it's a really interesting mix when you step back and you look at what is classified by the government as structural fixed assets, in other words, physical assets. When we talk about public utilities, we use the term capital intensity all the time. They've got to build a lot of stuff, a lot of plant in the ground or wherever to generate revenues one way or the other. And so there's two, in this particular graphic, there's two lines for each year, one showing the public side investment, which of course leans very heavily in the public transport area, and then one on the private investment, which is really dominated there by the energy sector. So what we see is, again, differences across sectors in terms of whether infrastructure is provided publicly or privately. Once it's provided privately, it usually falls into the regulated utility realm because there's still monopoly power. And those, if there are markets like for wholesale power, they're highly structured and organized. So given that backdrop, what I wanted to focus on is what's the difference between funding and financing? Why does it matter? How do they fund and finance, and what funding and finance methods are used to support the infrastructure, and what are their differential impacts? And then finally, what are the infrastructure investment gap, trends and gaps across the infrastructures, and how might we close them at different levels. And I should emphasize, I should have said this perhaps earlier, I am not a public sector finance expert. I'm sure all of you, actually many of you have more expertise than I do in that realm. I'm more on the, again, sort of the utility and regulatory economics side of it. So this has been really, again, educational for me, like all good projects, you know, gets your wheels spinning and thinking about the comparisons. So there's a summary again of funding, who pays, financing, how it's paid for. There's some definitions again around with funding, tax or sales revenues are the key instruments, and then financing, you know, some form of debt payments or equity payments. A big difference there is funding sources don't have to be repaid. Financing does have to be repaid. So when people, for example, one of the areas of common area of confusion, which I'll get to, is treating a debt instrument like a bond as a source of funding. It's really actually a means of financing. So I'll come back to that. So different instruments, we have different tax instruments, obviously. We have different types of rate design options we can implement. But again, we're sort of still stuck within those major categories. Same with debt and equity, and probably in that case, it's even more constrained because those are very market driven. We have different requirements on systems and utilities based on those. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that looks like in terms of the finances of a utility system or infrastructure provider. So I use this chart a lot. I developed it, you know, over the years in my work on water to think about what a viable system looks like. And again, it's really that right combination of spending and raising revenues to support those expenditures. So we want systems that are spending at the right level, not too much, but not too little, and then and somehow coming up with the revenues. Now, when I first, my early rendition of this would assume rate revenues, but I've really broadened my mind to say, well, that shouldn't necessarily preclude tax support for systems. And those can be, you know, that could be direct or it could be indirect in the form of a subsidized loan. So, but what we have in the real world is every combination of these. We've got systems that are spending too much, charging too much, spending too little, charging too little, and so on. So that's what we're really trying to improve if we can. So I mentioned that there's a connection here to cash flow. And so rather than thinking about everything being funding, I think there's a useful sort of cash flow analogy here. So cash inflow comes from taxes and user fees, cash inflow and outflow from debt and equity. So in other words, there's a plus, but there's also a minus because there's a cost to financing. And the net is the fiscal resources available for investing in infrastructure and operating systems. Basically, like a utility, or, you know, what's typical in the water sector at least is about 50% of what the value of utilities on the books is probably attributable to debt and at any given time. Of course, you know, it averages out over time. And then about 20% of their annual revenue requirements is to service that debt. So I provide a little illustration because this is the kind of stuff that I look at a lot, you know. So in my world, I'm looking at financial statements, I'm looking at income statements and balance sheets and cash flow statements. And so basically what you see if you think about utility providers, they've got revenues coming in but they've got expenditures both for the capital, you know, their capital spending, their operating spending, but then also for the financing itself. So you got it. So it kind of explains why we're confused. It's because both funding and financing provide a source of funds or a source of revenue or a source of fiscal resource for the provider. So again, when you see a lot of these graphs out there that basically show that they show funds or what I'm calling resources as coming from tax resources of all kinds, you know, federal, state, and so on. And then this is overall, and then bonds. This is from NASBO, National Association of State Budget Officers. And then for highways in particular, you can kind of see that, again, there's this combination of tax funds and other appropriations, but also bond receipts. So they will tend to, when they talk about their budget, they'll throw those bond resources in there, even though, again, a bond actually creates a liability. So keep that in mind, that when you talk about funding, it also creates that liability. And there's some other examples I have, again, from transportation and from water, which are often summarized together in the Congressional Budget Office reports, which are a wonderful resource on this topic. So I cite a lot of them. And not only do they give great reports, they include their data spreadsheets. So it's really great to use. But you can see that the federal government spends a fair amount, including on capital projects. But a lot of the action is at the state and local level. So we're really talking about burdens on communities, and their states to figure out how to fund infrastructure. And that includes both, again, capital and operating expenses. And so you see a role, for example, for the state in those, more so in transportation. But once you get to services like water, sewer, solid waste, so again, it's going to fall to the local level. So these things combine, financing and funding combine, and that is one of the defining characteristics of the different service delivery models we have for infrastructure. So if we combine taxes and public sector financing, usually in the form of ownership, you've got a public provider with a lower cost of capital and possibly a less regressive effect on customers. And I'll just define that in a little bit. When you have private sector financing, it does tend to raise the cost of capital, and some would say it also, may have weaker incentive effects. It may have stronger incentive effects on providers, but weaker incentive effects on users in terms of price signals. Sorry, that got cut off a little bit. I'll fix that. And I'll get back to this whole issue of taxes and user fees in terms of that regressive effect. Now, I just divided this public and private, but in the interest of intellectual honesty, we have to recognize there's actually a lot of different structural models for utilities and service providers. And it's important to keep in mind in particular that there's the cooperative model that falls between public ownership and private ownership. A cooperative system is member owned. And so I'm not going to go into the details here, but it's in the report just to kind of remind us that there is this important third distinction. So these are the dominant forms for both, certainly in the energy sector and to some extent in the water sector as well, although water has even a more diverse set of not-for-profit, utility models. So we have another paper on that if you're interested. But when you think about ownership, who owns the assets, which I think is the defining characteristic, it really does matter to governance, regulation, pricing, and so on. So I'm still working on this, but just to make the point that taxes versus user fees, there's a big difference. It's, their orientation is quite different. So, their social orientation, the role of subsidies and so on. Where taxes, we think of taxes as a way to sort of socialize or share burdens across society, smooth out differences in costs. User fees tend to really go to very specific, cost allocation schemes and so on. And I realize I have a mistake on there too. That should say stronger price signals. One of the reasons that we gravitate towards user fees is that it's hard. We have a perception that it's harder, it's more hard work to raise taxes. That's one of the reasons. And so it's considered, again, the user fee is considered a more technocratic approach and maybe more, maybe more comfortable for people to pursue than the hard work of raising taxes. So this is another chart I use. We teach rate making in our programs, and we have different concepts of cost, but a lot of these also, again, relate very closely to this utility construct of things, where we emphasize two things, especially full cost accounting. So we know that there's higher social value and cost to utility provision. And there's both positive and negative externalities. And those are really hard to capture through prices unless there's some sort of a taxation system. So we tend to focus on full cost accounting at the system level. And then when we get to revenues, we emphasize full cost recovery and full cost pricing, or full cost allocation. So full cost pricing is really about you know, trying to get the user to pay for pretty much everything. And so that's that idea of the user fee being the primary means of support, when in fact you can have these, you know, two different sources of revenues. So yeah, kind of keep that in mind as a backdrop too. I'll come back to some of those, but so grant funding, again, it's not my area of specialization, but we know there's different types of grants, and there's been an evolution in the grant field, and now we're really, not only have we moved towards more very specific, less discretionary types of grant funding, but in many ways, grant funding has morphed into financing. So we've shifted from funding support, especially from the federal government, to financing support. So a lot of these grants now are actually to support financing. So it's another reason why it's kind of hard to untangle. So you can see the funding, federal funding trends in infrastructure. First, for transportation infrastructure has maintained, you know, fairly high levels. We accept sort of tax-based and federal support for that to some extent, to a larger extent than we do for water infrastructure. So you can see, for, you know, again, the federal funding is the darker, is the bluer, you know, color there. And so that has a more prominent role in transportation than it does in water. And you can see in both cases, though, they seem to have sort of fallen flat. These are not adjusted for inflation. So if you, for utilities at the local level, we actually see pretty strong, support for infrastructure from utility-based revenues. So in other words, they are operating under that enterprise model. And pretty much, you know, some cases either breaking even or making money in gas, electricity, and sewer these days. This is more recent data. And then they run some deficits in the other areas, which means that they have to make up that revenue elsewhere. Now we accept subsidies, you know, transfers in the transit field pretty regularly, because we think, again, there's social benefits there. So here's the US trend in water and wastewater. So there is, you know, expenditures do exceed, in case of water, they do exceed the revenues. They're getting pretty close in sewer. But here's Michigan. We actually, we're doing a little better in water, perhaps. Well, actually, we're doing better in sewer and in water, but both of them have kind of, again, flattened a little bit. And so, or actually, no, I'm sorry, like the sewer actually is higher, and the expenditures are higher than the revenues that they're taking in. And so doing a little bit better on the water side. So one of the areas that I track at the Institute is the consumer price index for utilities. So we are seeing this price pressure in that realm. And so you can see water leads the way in terms of being highly inflationary right now, doing a little better in energy, and certainly much better in communications. So even though we spend a lot on communications, they haven't been highly inflationary. This is what people spend on utilities. And by the way, I update these every year. So if you need these data, just let me know. I'm glad to share. I've been tracking this for a couple decades now. So this is what we pay for infrastructure at our household level, and, you know, including water, electricity, and natural gas and telephone. So water is still relatively smaller share, but we've seen it growing. These are annual expenditures for a 4-person household. And then this is the percentage of total expenditures. So in the US, we've actually done a pretty good job, and we compare fairly well, I think, to Europe in terms of keeping the cost of these goods. Now, we don't include transportation in here, but keeping the cost of these services in the 6 to 7% range of total household expenditures. But here's the important message. Utility rates are very regressive, like sales taxes. So in other words, like there's very limited ability to control their impact on your household. And if you're a low-income household, you're going to pay quite a bit more as a percentage of your expenditures or income for utilities. And if you're a very poor household, this could be very high and could even jeopardize your home ownership. So it's a very serious issue. And this is why when people talk about funding new projects, new ideas, new innovations through utility rates, we have to keep that in mind, because chances are you're going to have that regressive effect on people. So even lofty goals like clean energy and lead service line removal and everything, along those lines, they have very positive benefits. We've got to be careful in terms of how we pay for them, or we could actually do some harm along the way. There's rate design options. This is again in our, big part of my bailiwick is how do we actually design rates. There certainly are different models there, and those can mitigate those regressive effects depending on how you do it. So one of the things I did here was I compared, our expenditures on utilities, the smaller, this trend, the first set of blocks, to taxes. So you can see the difference in terms of the regressive nature of utility bills as compared to taxes. So to the extent that, again, we can use tax instruments for some types of investments, that could have that more positive distributional effect. And it's not that some taxes can't be regressive, I'm aware of that too, but overall you have more opportunity to reduce those effects. And there's an example from Michigan, again, of those tax burdens, or Michigan compared to the US. And so we actually are a little bit better with the lowest 20% compared to the US average, but it's still, again, the tax burden by household income level overall is also going to be higher for smaller, for lower income families. So one of the, I think this might be in the wrong place, so I'm actually going to come back to that. But so when we talk about financing, one of the things to also keep in mind is that financing leverages the funding you have. So if you've got a revenue stream coming into the service provider, you can actually leverage that with financing options that will enhance that revenue stream over time. The other reason we like to see financing over time is because it enhances intergenerational equity. These services last a long time. These infrastructure investments, they can cross 2-3 generations of users. And so consumers, so we want to make sure that to the extent we can do it fairly and economically, we want to spread those costs over time. So using financing tools is perfectly appropriate. You don't want to have to pay for everything out of your pocket. But in terms of financing, so why is this important? Well, again, we've got differences in costs. So the financing instruments you use matter a lot ultimately to the cost of capital, but then to the overall cost of service. So, as you move up the chain in terms of instruments, and especially as you introduce more risk or more, market factors as well, in terms of, say, private investment, you're going to pay a higher rate of return for that investment. Now, the cost of capital has come down. Bond yields tell an amazing story. This is if any of you are in a position to consider refinancing infrastructure, now is a great time to do that. So that's a spread in the bond yields, corporate, government, and treasuries. So again, corporate's going to be a little bit higher. Then if you shift over to private investment, like investor-owned utilities, they actually get a risk premium. They get a risk and a return premium. So they're actually still earning pretty good returns. And utilities are still considered a pretty good investment by most. When we look at utilities, we look at their total weighted cost of capital. So I explained that in there, but the message here again is public sector debt. These are very generalized. This is just illustrative, but public sector debt is going to tend to be lower cost than private sector debt and equity. So again, I mentioned this earlier, we've moved from funding to financing. So instead of providing grants, we now provide loans. We underwrite loans. And so federal financing has become a very big share of the financing for the various sectors. Now, once in a while, you get a bit of a break, you get a principal forgiveness. Now, if you get principal forgiveness on a loan, that sort of converts it to funding. And technical sense, a subsidized loan is also a form of funding as well. So we have the major state revolving funds. You know, I'm more familiar with on the drinking water and clean water side a little bit, but there's the same programs also for highways or for the transportation sector, infrastructure banks. And so those are capitalized by the federal government, but they're administered at the state level with a 20% match. But they've become an incredibly important part of the portfolio for infrastructure. You can also have public-private partnerships, or you can have, and I want to really emphasize in the report, you can also have public-public partnerships. I mean, that's another way to sort of help lower certain costs and maybe even spread some risks. But private involvement can run from, you know, design, build, finance, and so on, all the way through full ownership. It has not taken off. There's a lot of rhetoric around it. To be honest, the real emphasis seems to be more on, especially in the water sector, more on acquisitions and ownership of utilities than on operations. But there's some activity, and there's always been private involvement in infrastructure projects and delivery. So that's not actually all that new. Private partners, again, there's some of the partner revenues are as reported by the CBO. There's some funding and private equity examples in transportation. And the point here is that if you move to a funding model that involves user fees, that is tolls, that tends to expand the private equity financing a little bit, you know, to some extent, but not necessarily by a very, very large amount. So but it may, you know, private investors may be more, the theory is that private investors are going to be more comfortable with a revenue stream coming from user fees than from government payments. So now finally, I'll try to go through this pretty quickly, but the infrastructure gaps or the investment gaps, you know, there's these report cards. I'm sure you've all seen it before. The American Society for Civil Engineers puts this out and talks about how bad our infrastructure is, gives us really low grades. Keep in mind 3 caveats. There's a member interest in this report that they tend to assume, I believe, in-kind replacement, which doesn't make sense in a dynamic environment. And they also tend to have some pretty significant growth, at least some, not necessarily ACE, but certainly other groups have growth assumptions built in. We have difficulty supporting costs of infrastructure, partly because it's sort of out of sight, out of mind. You know, a lot of our infrastructure, we don't see it every day. You know, we think that water comes out of the tap and electricity comes out of the wall. We don't think about the massive infrastructure behind it. And some of it is literally invisible to us on a day-to-day basis. But nonetheless, voter support is very high. I drew this intentionally to make sort of a peace sign. I thought that's kind of cool. So, but most voters actually surveyed this year actually expressed support for funding infrastructure. We get returns on that investment, public investment in infrastructure. You get a higher return for private investment, but you do get a positive return of something, you know, in the range of 5% on public infrastructure investment. Economists like to debate this stuff. They don't like us to use deficit spending for infrastructure, but they do recognize a role for it even in a short-term stimulus context. In the midterm, it could stimulate production and consumption, long-term prosperity, including inclusive prosperity. So when we talk about, you know, universal broadband and universal services of all kinds and affordable access, this is a big part of it. So, you know, here are the gaps in funding, the supposed gaps in funding, you know, in the ACE estimates these, especially in the transit area. There's less concern to some extent about the energy sector because the private sector is taking care of most of that, again, at a cost, but generally considered relatively effectively. And there's this is an example from AWWA, American Water Works Association, where a lot of their trillion, you know, 1.7 trillion estimate going through, I think, 2050, a whole bunch of that is for growth. And I would look at that very carefully. Michigan's 21st Century Infrastructure Commission looked at this and found that, you know, again, we have a big infrastructure need here. you know, big gaps, especially in transportation, but also in water, and to some extent in communications to bring broadband to everyone. The local level, we are spending on infrastructure. Those expenditure levels are going up. However, they're not keeping pace with the GDP. So there's both at the federal, in terms of federal grants and state spending. So what do we do with these gaps? This is the punchline, right? And this is what I was probably supposed to answer. And it's a really challenging set of questions, because again, there's just not an easy way to do this. Now, I'd rather, I need a better graphic, because this just sort of show like alligator jaws. You know, we want to close the gap, but we want to, there's been a presumption that that just means raising money. And I think we actually need to bring the costs down at the same time. So we do have technologies and tools to lower those costs: planning, asset management, you know, certain kinds of market-based approaches like competitive bidding. Mitch talked a little bit about that yesterday. Performance contracting, refinancing, having more access to low-cost financing. And then from the bottom, I think we need tax reform. I think we need rate reform. I think we need more blended approaches. And I think we need to move to I guess my bottom line recommendation, I don't think it's very insightful, but is that we need a dynamic portfolio of options of both funding and financing. We got to get away from the sort of dichotomized thinking. So I have the slide in here twice, but for some reason, so I did write another paper. So this is going to be my emphasis in this paper, but I actually wrote a recent paper calling for what I call an equity efficiency pricing model for water that borrows some concepts from the taxation system. So we'd calibrate a minimum bill to property value, property assessment, and provide a minimum usage allowance based on public health criteria. Then you price water more according to traditional economic criteria. One of my rationales for that is public water systems are built for public purposes, including fire protection and sanitation. So I think, you know, moving us in this direction could actually help us, you know, sort of rethink the way that utility construct around more of a broader public service construct. I'd also like to discontinue disconnection, because I think it's a bad public policy. And I think there's an alternative. We can deploy service limiters instead. We shouldn't be shutting people's water off, pandemic or no pandemic. It's just not good policy. So finally, there's a lot of great reports that I cite and include in the bibliography. One's by Deloitte in 2017, which lists a whole bunch of actual action items that utility and infrastructure providers can pursue to sort of address these issues. And I think there's, again, a lot of the same ideas emerge from different writers. But I guess my advice would be to move from dichotomy, funding versus financing, taxes versus fees, to a much more dynamic set of models, interactive, that include both traditional and non-traditional methods, and how they're related. And that would include even alternative equity instruments. Another paper I'll be working on after this one is on this concept of public equity or public shareholder, which could be an interesting hybrid model. And again, I think that probably is our best bet, is to diversify the way we think about how we pay for infrastructure, and to have the hard conversations with stakeholders in the community and let them, express their voices on this.